Hi and welcome back to the Old Doghouse Workshop. This week I'm concentrating on the universal head collar. The video you see at the moment is the result of one that I'd completed, but unfortunately it had a run out of 4th thou. The 4th thou run out was certainly not acceptable, so I just showed you here what I'd gone through, and despite all the planning I've got to throw this one away because it's scrap. I can't use it. Time to think out of the box. Well, I've been diving into skips again, or dumpster dipping, whatever you want to call it. I've picked up a stainless steel shaft. It was a bit bent, but after cutting two 100mm sections off it, you'll never know. There is of course an added bonus, is that it's sporting a nice 28mm ball. Because this chuck is about as accurate as a drunk darts player, I've opted to use the 4-jaw chuck. But the jaws on this chuck have been ground no better. I'm combating this issue by gripping the material using the tips of the jaws. At this stage I'm only roughing the 38mm dimension down to the shoulder. Because of the way I'm holding the material, I can see the potential for the material to slip in the jaws. So I've machined a bit of bar leaving a shoulder and a centre hole in it. This bar will act as a truing device, a steady and an advanced warning should the material move in the jaws. Therefore, as the chuck rotates the material rotates the live centre. If the live centre stops rotating even for a fraction of a second, it's time to stop the machine and take a look and see why. Now, I've rough machined the spigot down to 40mm, and that's this one complete at this stage. I'm going to use a homemade boring bar set between two centres. You could call it a line boring tool. And I'm going to mount the collar on two V-blocks, but as I've explained before, I've got very little equipment, so I'm having to make do and mend with whatever I can find to do the job. I've just clocked up the backing plate, and I'm now putting material down in order to raise the height of two V-blocks that will support the collar at the right height for when I put the boring bar in. To hold everything in place, I'm going to use a bit of hardened bar across the top. I'm using two modified coach bolts to hold everything in place, and yes, they are a little bit rusty. With everything set and tight, it's time to remove the 4-jaw chuck and put the MT4 centre into the chuck holder. The red driver dog that you see here was a complete disaster. It slipped, so I ended up having to swap it out for something a little bit more substantial. Using this line boring technique removes the potential for tapering in the bore in an ideal world, except that there's always a little bit of taper due to wear at the cutting edge of the tool. At the end of every pass, I slack the tailstock off to allow the line boring bar to drop a little, moving the upward facing cutter away from the material, thus preventing scoring of the parts or damage to the cutting edge. Before I adjust the cutting edge, I'll check the tool height using the dial test indicator first. Then I'll set the dial test indicator to 0, slack off and adjust the tool by the required amount and retighten. Bearing in mind that the bar size will open out by twice the amount that's been added. As always, before I start the cut, I'll make one last check using the DTI. Using the self-setting bore gauge and a micrometer, I'll confirm the size at the starting end and then at the finishing end, just to confirm how tapered it is. If the error is only a few tenths of a thou at size, then I shall use a bit of emery cloth on some wood dowel to buff out the error. Otherwise I've got to reset the boring bar and the cutter and start the cut from the opposite end first. As it happens, the taper was negligible, so nothing else to be done. To enable me to continue with the next phase of the operation, machining the OD of the collar true to its bore, I'll need an extended MT4 dead centre and a fitted mandrel. Making the extended MT4 dead centre wasn't too difficult, but I had to make a couple of modifications. One was because of the bore in the chuck was smaller than the standard MT4 centre. The tapered seat on the new dead centre would be shorter and less stable. That doesn't matter because I'm going to employ a little trick to ensure concentricity. Before that, I have to ensure that the concentricity between the outside part of the mandrel and the centre cones are as true as I can possibly get them. I'm using the flexibility in the extended chuck centre and the jaws to get the first end as true as I possibly can. Then I'm using a modified steady to complete the machining of the 60-degree cone centre. Once the coning is complete at both ends, I can then put the collar on the mandrel. With the mandrel now being true at the centres and the collar now on the mandrel, I will be able finally to machine the outside diameter as true as I possibly can to the bore. The jaws are going to serve two purposes. One is that they are going to drive the material, and two, they will help centre this end of the mandrel. Remembering of course that the dead centre at the chuck end is not very stable, but it will allow a little flexibility for setting at this end. Of course, the end that is nearest the tailstock is as true as I can get it anyway. Turning the collar around to machine the other side is a simple matter of undo the centres, undo the jaws, turn the collar around, replace the mandrel back between the centres, then use a combination of the jaws and the DTI to set the job true at the chuck end. Right, that was the last cut, and I just need to wipe it down and then check it all round for size. There is the very tiny amount of taper, but it's so small, and as you see here it just proves to be a tiny bit on the tight side going into the main body, but when it's through there's no rattle when it's in there, and it will spin, but just a little bit. Now all I have to do is to make a locking ring to fit on the 38mm dimension, and here I get started. Well, just as I'd got going on this locking ring, the lathe decided to pack up. I contacted the suppliers, as you can imagine, who very quickly replaced the entire lathe with a new one. And as you can see, it's a very nice shiny new lathe. Now I can finish the collar. After turning, I drilled the collar locking ring and tapped it for a 6mm grub screw. And while I was at it, I also put a small countersink in the main collar to prevent the grub screw damaging anything. And here we have the finished product. One collar complete with a locking ring, with a run out, according to my dial test indicator, is negligible, and that's a whole lot better than the previous unit. All done. Now all that's needed is for me to make the 31.75 or 1¼ inch inner adapter mandrels, and that'll be in the next video. thumbs up if you like the video, and as always I'll be only too pleased to answer any comments that you have. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.